Please welcome Brad Staples, CEO of APCO Worldwide, a highly experienced public affairs leader. Brad has devised and conducted reputation and communication programs for multinational companies. Brad also built APCO's global antitrust and competition practice. And today, Brad will talk about how public affairs will look like in the new normal.
So I have bitten off far more than I can chew with this particular topic. I know that for sure. Who the heck can make sense of this reality that we're all living in? It's exceptionally complex and difficult to decipher. I know I shouldn't be biting anything at all, because in my week in India this week, I find myself with emergency dental issues, and I just want to make a shout out to the Asian Heart Hospital in Mumbai for helping me get through a particularly difficult moment. Anyway, let me get into the topic. We are living in an adjusted reality without any question. Sometimes it seems to resemble a bygone era. It feels a bit like a return to the Cold War times or that interwar period of uncertainty in the world. But it's definitely complex. And what I want to talk to you about is how business is responding to the normality that it now faces, and how that impacts and shapes the way we can advise and support our clients, if you're in consulting or in an agency, or your business, if you're advising the C-suite on dealing with this host of complex and ever-changing issues. It's extraordinary how at the moment we find ourselves inundated by images of wealth creators. There seem to have been billionaires that are appearing left, right, and center during the course of the last 2 years. COVID has energized and created entrepreneurship and created wealth across the globe. We might have anticipated that some of that wealth creation would have petered down to a larger population, that we'd be feeling and sensing improving education, healthcare, lower mortality rates, more innovation and technology actually impacting our lives. But I don't think many of us genuinely feel that surge of new wealth across the population at large. And I think for millions and millions of people, that wealth creation is meaningless and doesn't touch them. And they feel as though what should be a golden age, if you like, a belle epoque right now, where technology is driving so much change and development in the economy, is just not having an impact. And in fact, as we have seen, recession is upon us. The IMF has suggested that global growth will slow to about 3.2% in 22 and down to under 3% next year. The Western economies probably won't grow more than 0 to 1% in the coming 12 months. It'll be a little better for India, which is close to 7% growth now, but it will slow too. And every week or so, it seems the economists are downgrading their expectations in terms of growth. How societies are going to deal with that and how that's going to create new tensions in the world is something that business leaders have to grapple with, and we have to advise and think about. That slowdown is coupled with inflation, and that combination we've not seen for quite some time. Inflation could be at 8.3% by the end of this year, and between 8 to 11, 12% in the West during the coming year. And India, which is well placed to navigate inflation, will have challenges too. So as billionaires argue about who's going to get into space first, tens of millions of people can't pay their energy bills and can't put food on the table. And that is the reality that we live in and the businesses that we advise or that we represent exist in. Countries seem to be dragging their feet when it comes to climate change. All those bold commitments, you just wonder how many will actually come to bear fruit, and we'll see what Egypt can do with the COP process this year. But we're certainly seeing and feeling the effects this group of people particularly, of temperatures we've never known before, of crops failing, of floods in cities and in rural areas literally across the globe. The public's still being told that they've never had it so good and they should feel confident and happy about the future. But the truth is, for many, many people, it just doesn't feel like that. And that distortion, I think that's the new reality. That disconnect is where many of the people we're reaching out to, that's the place they inhabit. And it has created an anger and a frustration and social tension that is bubbling up across the globe, and I sense that we're only seeing the start of it. In the last 2 years in the US, we've seen racial tensions spill over into the streets. We've found socio-political tribes on the streets of Washington, D.C., engaging in violence that probably we never would have anticipated. We've had climate strikes across multiple continents this year, and we've seen governments fall in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, and in the Middle East because of the cost of living and an inability to respond to it. And when you get to countries like Sri Lanka or Lebanon, all those issues bear fruit, and they're combined with kleptocracy and systemic failure that makes the life experience for citizens in those places really challenging at this moment. And you can add to that list. You could add Uzbekistan, Ecuador, Egypt, where those countries' systems and economies are in a very fragile state. And these are all places where our leaders are looking to build business, create growth, and engage with stakeholders. You really feel that distorted reality on social media, where these tribes congregate with mutually reinforcing ideas and perspectives on the world, to the extent now that they struggle to connect with their neighbors. You have populations in the same place who view reality very, very differently because the lens through which they make sense of the world has become distorted by mutually reinforcing data and information that defines things in very different ways. Now, you might have noticed that I've not mentioned COVID yet, really, and I haven't mentioned war in Ukraine. So why don't we talk about those two things and the impact they're having and what kind of change that's going to bring. So, amongst the many things that COVID has done, it has broken and it has remade trade alliances across the world. The economic priorities have been reset by COVID. We've seen great investment in India because Western companies recognize they can no longer rely on supply chains in China. But we're seeing a mix of shortening supply lines, multi-shoring, offshoring, friend-shoring, a new expression that I was becoming familiar with just the other week. Businesses are looking to find ways to secure their future, and it's redefining global priorities, and COVID accelerated that. We've also seen the fundamental social contract between citizens and governments reset by COVID. It's not so long ago that we found ourselves locked in our own homes, accepting levels of restriction and inability to move that we never would have thought society would accept. But we did. And we also sought financial support as companies and individuals from government that we never would have anticipated. And fiscally conservative administrations doling out money in ways that had never been seen before. The relationship between employer and employee has been reset, and it won't go back. That's part of that new normal. We've all become used to remote working, hybrid working. Some companies have moved to a situation where they're embracing a totally mobile workforce, enabled to operate from wherever they feel most comfortable and they feel they can be most productive. Companies like Airbnb are doing just that. I saw that Nick Clegg, the head of global affairs for Meta, is moving back to London from Silicon Valley, from Menlo Park. And it's just the latest in a chapter of Meta's senior executives dispersing themselves across the globe. I'm not sure that the staff at Menlo Park are getting the same opportunities, but the leadership is doing that. So things are changing, and they're evolving. The war in Ukraine, if we move on to that for a second, it has strengthened the transatlantic alliance. NATO is stronger. It now has Finland and Sweden joining. And the European Union seems stronger because it will have new candidates in Ukraine and Moldova and countries in the Western Balkans. But it's reset the dynamic in Europe, which poses some interesting challenges for the future. More importantly, for business, the war has required companies to take ideological sides, aligning with governments in the countries in which they're based, to either be on the side of the West or Russia, and also more and more on the side of the West or China. And business in India finds itself right at the intersection of these challenges in terms of where business aligns for the future. So that globalization that we'd all become used to over the last 20 plus years has dissipated, and we now find ourselves in a place where business needs to navigate pandemics, populist leaders, and geopolitical developments that are unpicking the globalized world that we knew. And global politics and business are intertwined in a way that we never understood would happen, and it's quite an extraordinary thing. I define it as a new era of multi-stakeholderism, where everything is now political. International trade and international business has become weaponized. Governments call on business leaders, and they deploy power in the trade context to achieve political goals. And CEOs and business leaders are being used as tools in diplomacy or to achieve political outcomes. They're essentially proxies for decision makers and leaders getting what they want in a global context. And they're the route through which they achieve those objectives. And you see it in several ways. Let's go back a couple of years to the demonstrations in China and how many companies found themselves caught in the crosshairs or in the friction between Beijing and Hong Kong. Companies like Cathay Pacific, HSBC, some lost their CEOs because they were unable to navigate the complexity of this. The NBA was caught out in that. And they've seen market share fall in China because a large percentage of the population won't buy those products anymore or won't use those services. And just last year, you could add H&M, Nike, New Balance, Adidas to that list because they all took a stand on Xinjiang and the treatment of the labor force in the cotton industry. And that's led again to boycotts from Chinese elites. We all watched Nancy Pelosi this week in Taiwan. You can be sure that as part of the response from China to a bold step by the Speaker of the House being in that country, Western business and American companies will bear the brunt for that political move. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but it's the reality that we're in, and we will see more of this. India, too, is part of this new dynamic. If you're a Chinese tech company that once saw this as a land of opportunity for selling product or selling your mobile applications, it's no longer as easy to get access to this market, as we all know. And on the basis of privacy and security concerns, and probably very real national security issues, the markets are closing down for some of those businesses. There are companies like Microsoft that have decided they're going to fully embrace this new dynamic. They've hired, in fact, they're now on their second UN ambassador for the company in New York, representing the corporate interests in engaging with the UN system and the multilateral process. Because they know as a corporation, they need to be part of that world of diplomacy. The biggest and the most profound change that is resetting the nature of public affairs and government relations is the massive withdrawal of companies from Russia in response to the invasion in Ukraine. That has reset the paradigm. Never before have we seen anything like that. The companies that withdrew, or those that chose to remain, found themselves on lists, found themselves being scrutinized, find themselves under pressure from governments in the West or government in Moscow. It's a moment that resets the nature of the relationship between business and politics. There's some other dimensions as well that I'll just explore for a minute and then talk about how it relates to public affairs. There's a tension between global and local. Operating locally, maintaining a license and being relevant in your own country and operating locally and being present on the global stage. For US firms that require supplies of essential parts and equipment from China or access to that massive consumer market, they now have to grapple with the American Uyghur Labor Prevention Act in China. Difficult sometimes to navigate that, and with impacts that I've already mentioned for some companies. HSBC now finds itself under pressure from investors in the bank that want it to split between a China-focused banking business and an international operation, and that pressure is very strong. The other tension is between creating value and having corporate values. And we see CEOs and businesses struggle profoundly sometimes to decide which of these issues they're going to get involved in. And that could be on ESG topics, it could be gender balance questions, it may be human rights awareness, questions of abortion or equality. These issues are all in play, and consumers and employees and stakeholders expect business leaders to take ownership of these questions and to have a confident, clear response on topics that sometimes emerge very, very rapidly, and they struggle with it. Danone's Emmanuel Faber, the CEO of the company previously, found himself in an impossible position between business culture and these expectations, and he lost his role. Kevin Snyder at McKinsey, same thing. Business culture and grappling with these questions, something that the partners and the business didn't find was acceptable. So leaders find themselves in a no-win situation when they're not able to navigate where and how they can engage on some of these, what can be quite divisive social issues. I think this is manifest and immediate in the US right now. It's very present as a topic that business leaders wrestle with in Europe. And to an extent it is in India, and I think it will grow here. It'll grow because some of these issues, particularly questions around cost of living, are going to become very much more apparent for many more people. These questions of women's rights, gender equality, religious tolerance, they can't be ignored. They can't be ignored by anybody in leadership positions in business. So what does that mean for us? Well, I think we have to ask some fundamental questions of our businesses, if you're representing a corporation, or of our clients, if you're in the agency and the client world. We've got to help them to navigate or to reconcile local aspirations and being in global markets, and to manage the tension and the distortion that comes with that. If you're the head of public affairs or managing global affairs from India for an Indian corporation on the global stage, these are visceral, very real challenges that our colleagues in our sector are grappling with. Government affairs and public affairs have now become central to business planning and strategy in a way that they weren't before. You now find topics and issues related to geopolitics talked about in the boardroom when they would just have been a topic over dinner before the meeting actually began. Crisis management, securing a license to operate, and finding the capacity to expand and achieve commercial success, they require deeper understanding and the capacity to navigate public affairs issues in a way that we've never known before. And companies are under this pressure to engage on topics that they could have let slip by in previous years. There's a challenge which I think Indian businesses are going to have to wrestle with as they look at building business globally. How much do you align with the national agenda? How much does your brand become associated with the national program and the national agenda? You can be associated with all the wonderful things about a country, whichever country it is. The energy, the entrepreneurship, the optimism, the expansion. But you'll also be associated with all the things that are less well-liked or trusted or valued in other parts of the world. It's a very difficult challenge to stay close to leadership, because that's essential for business success locally, but also be able to navigate this complexity worldwide. For some companies that are going to be present in Qatar at the World Cup later this year, they're going to be present and associating their brand and their business with a country that has some questions to answer over LGBT rights, labor conditions, and a host of other issues. They're under the spotlight on those topics already. Companies associated with the golf tournament that the Saudis have launched are also finding that association a little uncomfortable. And the US will keep trying to put pressure on businesses in relation to China, and the Chinese have made it very clear that if you're going to take a stand on human rights issues or make proclamations as a business on those questions, you're going to face headwinds in building business in that country. So, public affairs and government relations are now essential to business. They're fundamental to business partnerships. During COVID-19, government relations and public affairs teams were called upon as the primary tool to save businesses, to seek funding, whether to manage a furloughing process, to engage government to get support. That recast that role. And I think the legacy of that is that it's recast for the long term. I've noticed more and more that we're engaging with the General Counsel, Head of Strategy, Human Rights, the HR function, with internal comms, the whole panoply of roles in the C-suite now, in a way that we just didn't do that before, because these topics are so relevant to all aspects of running a company. So, where is a corporation or an agency or a consultancy going to make a difference? I think we can do lots of things to help and really support business. One, get access to some of the great data and insights and information that are out there now, distill that, process that information, and present it in a way that leaders can use in a really smart and informed way. Bring senior leaders of business into regular contact with those that know and understand these issues with deep expertise, so that they're understanding what's happening in China, what's going to take place in India, and they can navigate some of these complex issues. Build alliances and build partnerships. Find trusted allies who may be in civil society, maybe NGOs or others, whose standing with stakeholders is high and with whom you can have an association that just reinforces what the business truly believes in and is committed to. And this is a great moment to audit corporate values, to look at ESG activities, and just get businesses ahead of some of the challenges and issues that are coming down the track. This is the kind of work that APCO does. It does it in India. We have a great team here, and they're helping international companies to navigate the complexity of dealing with government at a state level and at a national level, and also manage the complexity of regulation in India. And we do that, I think, in a very authentic way around the world from all of the 30-plus locations in which we operate. So for communications practitioners and for public affairs practitioners, we have an important role. First of all, to understand what the heck is going on, to really know what's going on and to take an interest globally in what's happening on all of these critical questions. Be informed, be engaged, and be in a position to offer real insights to the CEO, not just within a public affairs department. And I think we have to help companies, even some of the biggest ones, navigate very narrow channels on some of these issues without running aground in any way. And I think this is the new normal. This is the world that we're in. Corporates have got to recognize that geopolitical risk management is at the center of taking decisions for the future. And those that do that are going to be the ones that have a broad view on a host of rich topics and can rely on a confident perspective on their own values so that they can take a decision swiftly and respond when new issues emerge, which they do. We can't afford to get caught off guard as advisors to business on any of these issues, nor can we afford to find ourselves in the middle of some of these tectonic shifts which are happening all the time. So I don't know whether you're involved in the world of public affairs or you'd like to be, or you want to be advising and guiding business leaders on these topics. But this moment, and I've been doing this for 30 plus years, is not like any other. It's an exciting and extraordinary time to be involved in this business. So thanks for giving me your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brad. Invite Ramya Rajagopalan, Head of Communications and Diversity at Siemens India. Thank you, Ramya.
You know, I'm going to pick up the conversation from the last point you stated. If there is any time to be in public affairs and be in a role that can be engaging with companies and corporates to make a difference in the world in the existing scenario, it's probably now. This is probably a room which has a lot of communication professionals, traditional PR practitioners from agencies. If they want to make a shift to public affairs, what is the skill set that they need and what is it that they need to change to make that shift to public affairs?
Well, the one thing I would say is everything you've learned so far, or everything that this group has been doing, perhaps in a more traditional PR sense, is entirely valid, needed, and essential to doing public affairs work well. The critical conversations are taking place online. These communities that are forming on topics that I was talking about are doing that in a digital context on different platforms or in lively social media interactions that one has to know how to engage, shape, and participate in a really authentic way. So all of those skills, fundamentally valid to what we're talking about. I think if you're engaged and interested in the world and interested in issues, whatever they may be, I think one has a couple of choices: to go super deep on a sector or a set of issues, or keep a broad, holistic view of what's going on in the world. The biggest challenge, and it's for APCO colleagues as much as I suspect young people wanting to be in this area, is to build the confidence to give advice and to remain open to listening all the time, because we get great insights everywhere, every day, that can be truly valuable in guiding our clients on tackling public affairs topics. I rely as much on the conversations I have with my kids or my kids' friends as I do on chatting to government leaders or diplomats for insights, and they're all equally valid. So creating that capacity to be a sponge and then deploy that information in a smart way, I think that's part of the journey.
Yeah, and I can see that given the situation that's happening in the world, people are all gearing and moving towards public affairs because they know that that is a critical element and probably an extension to communications really, and probably something that people can gravitate to. You've been doing public affairs for over 30 years, 35 years in Europe.
Yeah, don't keep adding the years.
No, it's only to explain the gravitas and the experience that you have in US, UK, Europe, India, Asia Pacific countries. What is the key difference that you notice in all these geographies? And maybe at the last point you can specifically maybe emphasize a little bit on India as well, because it could be the ability to listen, it could be corruption, it could be bribery, it could be a whole host of issues that one deals with when you're doing public affairs.
Yeah. We could spend all day talking about this. I mean, it's such a rich topic. India is glorious for somebody who does what I do because it's so complex. Because politics has a real high pace, kind of visceral quality here. And the media plays such a lively part in shaping discourse, in pushing back and informing conversation, both in an online and in a more traditional context. And that interplay between media, politics at a national level, state level, it has a complexity that draws anybody that's interested in how decisions are made to this country. And it's difficult to navigate from outside. It actually has a poor reputation internationally. India is perceived to be far more complex to do the kind of work we do than it genuinely is, I think, and it puts off business investment, which is a problem. I think in Europe, something happened during COVID, and it's going to be accelerated by the midterm elections and as the US goes into another election cycle. The European Union has decided that it's the global regulator. It's set the standard in terms of data protection rules with GDPR, and in competition and antitrust, on environmental questions, on social issues. The EU believes that it's regulating not just for the 27 countries, but for the world at large. And if you see the package of legislation and regulation that's impacted the big tech companies, the way they've been described as gatekeepers by the EU, that package has leapt ahead of what's coming in America, and we're going to see a slowdown in the process of government decision-making in the US, and that moment will be seized by the Europeans. So I think that's an element that's a challenge. Kleptocracy has also flourished during COVID, and there are a whole host of people who are wrestling with the challenges of dealing with kleptocracy and embedded corrupt systems across the globe. Unfortunately, I think the war in Ukraine will accelerate that problem in a really significant way. But as I say, I could talk forever about this, so I won't say more.
Yeah, I mean, the war in Ukraine, and you spoke about it at length, has impacted us in more ways than one. And as you said, countries and regions and businesses have necessarily had to take a stance, right? India did take a stance as well, and where we decided not to take a stance, and that was the stance we took. But coming back to your experience in working in various markets, I'm especially interested to know about UK. Did you have a role to play, and how did you manage the whole Brexit issue? And now with the elections happening in UK, which is the biggest hot topic, wanted to understand how is that going to shape things in a different way?
I wish I could say I was optimistic. I'm not sure that I am. I mean, Brexit was the single worst act of self-harm that any country's committed upon itself in living memory. I have a view on this topic, you might have noticed. I sit squarely within the Remain camp. And I think Britain's paying the full economic price now.
Yeah.
And it's going to pay its diplomatic and its global decision-making role over time, because its economy will be marginalized and it will lose a place that it has held, rightly or wrongly, for a long time on global issues. I would like to think that we would be having our first Prime Minister of Indian origin. I'm not sure that we will.
You're not sure
I'm
it
not
will
sure
happen?
it will happen. I think if it were down to the parliamentary party, it would happen. I think the membership on the Conservative Party are not quite ready for that yet. But one thing we can be sure of is we will all not be much older before we have our first Prime Minister of Indian origin. There is no question about that. There are so many strong candidates.
Yeah.
On both sides. But I think the Conservatives have done well in getting a really diverse mix of talent in prospective leadership roles. And I think Labour should be stronger in that area, and I hope they will be soon.
And the gentleman from the Indian origin is paying the price for coming from a background
there's the great irony, right? The irony here is he's the elitist in this contest. He's the establishment guy. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it's an irony, you're right. you talked about so many scenarios in the world today, from a Chinese point of view, Ukraine war, COVID. Would you like to share, I know you may not be able to share names of certain companies, but would you like to share a few examples of some of the biggest crises that you've handled at a global scale? Need not be necessarily with India, but if there is anything from an Indian context, we'll be happy to hear. We completely understand if you can't take names.
I'd love to give you the Indian examples, but I won't give you the Indian examples.
Because we would know what it is.
Because you'll all know them so well, and that I don't want to reveal all of that. Well, we are acting as the international communications firm to support the government of Ukraine right now. So we're working directly for President Zelensky and Andriy Yermak, who's the head of his office, handling their communications.
How long have you been working with them for now?
Not from the beginning, but for the last few months.
It can be very stressful.
It's very stressful for the team, but I've got to tell you, they are extraordinary people. I've seen our team working 24/7 for week upon week, helping to navigate some of the stories. We focused principally on EU candidate status for Ukraine to try and push that early, and that was we all had a good outcome. That's not just these things are never down to a consulting firm, obviously, but the government had a great success there. And then now it's really about informing and shaping the debate around sanctions and just avoiding fatigue setting in around the conflict. Because there's fatigue around that war here. I can tell you there's a lot more fatigue in Europe about that war amongst the population.
Yeah, because I work with Siemens. We are headquartered in Germany, which is right in the center of all of this. And right from the day one of the war, from when it happened to now, which is 3+ months, things have changed. There is a lot of fatigue and let's get done and over with, let's move on. And with the gas problem coming in for Germany in a big way, rest of Europe of course, but Germany is going to have to face it in probably in more ways than anyone else in Europe.
Well, you guys have been part of the conversation recently with the gas turbine that was returned from Canada.
And we've exited Russia as well.
And you've exited Russia too. So you find yourselves constantly being pulled into this conversation one way or another. It's a great example of that, of a company like Siemens with global aspirations and local business needs being pushed and pulled all the time around these issues.
We cannot sit in the sidelines anymore. You mentioned about that, every company, every country having to take a stance. We tried not to. We also have responsibility to our employees in Russia, right? We have a huge business in Russia. We have four-figure team members sitting there. What is our responsibility to our employees in Russia? They are right in the middle of this for no fault of theirs. So it's been, I think, very difficult for every company, every organization around the world.
You should know, we opened our office in Russia in '89. We stopped commercial activity when this war broke out. That's the last thing in the world we wanted to do. It's the same for Siemens, but on a much smaller scale. It is truly a disaster for the Russian people. And although we're helping the Ukrainian government with their communications, I think we have enormous empathy and great concern for the future of Russia.
Yeah, and everybody has taken strong stances, and it's unfortunate, and our heart goes out to our colleagues there, right? And yeah, it's really an unfortunate situation. Moving on to a slightly lighter topic, Brad, you come often to India. I know COVID didn't allow you to come often to India, but very often we ask our friends who come from outside, what is your favorite Indian food? And you can name a couple of them. That's fine, because you can't have just one favorite Indian food.
Okay, so I come from Leicester in the UK. I'm not unfamiliar when it comes to Indian food, right?
They say chicken tikka is the chicken tikka
masala is the national dish in
food of
Britain.
UK.
Yeah, it is. So I had the opportunity, in spite of my dental issues, to get to grips with Goan cuisine for the first time on this trip. And
so
I thought
had some Goan cuisine. Okay.
That was fantastic. That was really wonderful. So that's my latest favorite.
Okay. So after chicken tikka, it's go
I
on
don't
food.
eat chicken tikka.
You don't? Okay. Any latest books or any series that you're watching that you would like to share?
So I drove my wife nuts by watching Blitzing Stranger Things, which I hadn't watched at all. I don't know if you've seen that, but I totally loved that. I mean, it's complete garbage, I know, but I loved it. Books, on the heavier side, I'm reading Bill Browder's Red Notice, which is about the era of oligarchs in Russia, because it's a period that I think has passed us, and it's fascinating. And another book on the same topic at the same time. But I try to consume anything and everything I can get my hands on, really. It tends to be the way.
Do you read Indian authors too?
Do I read Indian authors?
authors?
No, I don't, because I really haven't dipped in enough into Indian. Into Indian authors. What I've got to do is spend more time when I'm not working here. That's what I'd really like to do.
Probably I can ask Rahul to help you pick up a couple of good Indian
Rahul
books.
is a great source of literary advice already.
You should pick up a couple of good Indian authors when
Great.
you're leaving as well. 3 things we don't know about Brad. I mean, we probably don't know many things, but...
Well, you didn't know I was from Leicester, so I'm from Leicester. I also have a farm in Italy,
Wow.
and we grow barley and wheat, and we have olive trees and other things. And I became an Italian citizen. That might have been linked to Brexit.
Okay.
So there's 2 or 3 things.
That's nice. And when are you coming back to India again?
Oh, they'll drag me back soon enough, I'm sure.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brad. And
Great.
I hope you had a good time in India, meeting all your customers and clients here.
It's been great.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.
Thank you so much, Ramya, Brad.